Welcome to Science Frontiers, a space for discussions in the frontier areas of science, technology, and society. I am your host, Binay Panda. In today's episode, we shall discuss about retractions in science articles, their importance, and their role in truthful content in science communications. To do this, we have a very special guest, Ivan Oransky. Ivan is the editor-in-chief of The Transmitter, a distinguished journalist in residence at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, and the co-founder of Retraction Once. Ivan, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with a bit of introduction. Can you tell our listeners about Retraction Watch? How did you and your co-founder Adam Marcus start it, the motivation behind it, and what is Retraction Watch's business model?
Sure. So Adam Marcus is my co-founder at Retraction Watch. He and I established it, created it in August of 2010. So as we're speaking today, it's not quite 14 years, but very close. And what prompted me to suggest that we do this was a really terrific, hard-hitting set of stories that Adam did for the publication that he at the time was the managing editor of, called Anesthesiology News. He reported on a case here in the US of someone named Scott Rubin, who had faked all of the patients, in other words, all of the study participants, in at least 25 different papers, which have all now since been retracted. Rubin ended up going to federal prison here for charges related to the scientific misconduct. He paid restitution, a few $100,000 US. So it was a big case. And Adam had just done amazing work on this story, and no one else knew about it. And the reason Adam was able to do it was that he knew all of the anesthesiology journal editors. This was his job, to report on anesthesiology. And when I was very taken with this story, as is probably clear, and I called him one day after we had, traded emails and realized we had a shared interest in retractions and scientific fraud and sort of scientific integrity. I said, let's start a blog because A, all these stories are hiding in plain sight. All these retractions are out there. And B, the retraction notices, the notifications that go along with the retraction event are, they're not great. Some of them are actually wrong. Some of them are just sort of opaque. Some are misleading. And that's not good for science. So let's just dig in. Let's try and do this. He said, sure. And neither of us really had any sense of what we were getting into. I mean, I had learned how to blog doing some other, and how that worked and the mechanics of it and thinking about an audience and all of those things. And Adam and I are longtime journalists. Even by then, we had been journalists each for well over a decade. But we really had no idea what we were getting into. So in terms of the business model, when we first launched it, we had no business model. We created, anyone can, it's still true. You can start a blog and, if you're interested in doing it, you just kind of do it when you do it. That worked for a little while, but it became quite a big endeavor. We were spending a lot of time on it, still are, quite a lot of time. But, fast forward maybe 14 years, we have reached some level of, I don't know if Adam and I have reached some level of maturity, but at least the blog and its business model have reached some level of maturity. And so we're a nonprofit, which the laws, and the regulations here in the US just means means two things. One is that no one actually owns it. So we are not owners of this. It's a nonprofit. It's a sort of a public ownership, if you will. The other is that people can make contributions to it tax-free. So in other words, or they're tax deductible, I should say. And so we are, that benefits us, obviously, and that's a standard model in many places, certainly here in the US. So, currently we're the way we're funded, and, we're quite transparent about things. We publish our tax returns and all of that. Our current budget, or, for this year, and I think for the foreseeable future, given some stability in funding and what we want to do, it's about $400,000 US, which I know in different parts of the world is a lot of money. Here, that's enough to support 4 not quite full-time. We have sort of one full-time employee and three employees who are, 2/3 or 80% time, mostly because of, their choices. So, 4 employees, a lot of freelancers and contractors. About a third of that comes from the fact that our database, which we'll probably talk about, the Retraction Watch database, was acquired last year, September of 2023, by Crossref, another nonprofit, which is a terrific development for many reasons. One of them, though, is that provides us with a steady stream of funding to do that work. So that's about a third of our budget. A third of our budget right now comes from a grant from something called the Wood Next Foundation, and they fund, the journalism side. So in other words, the Crossref obviously funds the database side of our work and of our business. This Wood Next Foundation grant, which we're very grateful for, and really helps us funds the journalism part of our work. And then the other third is a combination of individual donations. People have been very generous, and they believe in our work, and they literally put their money where their mouth is, and we're so grateful for that. And those are sometimes, $5 donations. Sometimes they're, in the low 5-figure donations, again, all US dollars. And also sort of other, what we call earned revenue that we, so if Adam and I give a talk and someone pays an honorarium, that goes into the organization. And also any time we write for another news organization and there's a payment, a freelance payment involved, that goes into the organization. So we have a very robust and wonderful partnership with Science Magazine, where we publish investigations there, bigger stories, and they pay us as they would freelancer. It's a wonderful relationship. And so together that's about a third if you add those things together. Bit granular, not sure how much detail you wanted or were interested in, but we always try and be transparent about where our funding comes from. I remain a volunteer, and Adam is paid a very small stipend, because he's doing a lot of all the top editing of the stories that we do. But essentially he and I are, basically volunteers or completely volunteer in my case. And that's how we sort of support things. But it's and we've had right now, like I said, we're pretty stable. I'm quite pleased by that. I don't wake up every morning wondering, where I'm going to raise money, which other nonprofits at our size or even our age, I think still do. So we're very fortunate, and the support of the community writ large has been really important to us. We'd of course like to grow, and we can always use more funding. And now I'm looking at years from now instead of worrying about even next year's budget. I'm kind of thinking ahead. But we want to be here for the long term, and the only way a nonprofit can do that is by obviously always thinking about whether it's donations, grants, earned revenue. By hook or by crook, and thanks to some experience that I've had serving on other nonprofit boards, I've learned how these things work and how to make it work for us. And so we're stable without being entirely sustainable, or certainly necessarily going to be growing that much anytime soon. But stability is pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time and discussing and telling us in detail. Now, as you know, science should be self-correcting, but often, as you have noted in the past too, even genuine retractions are not publicized or reported in the media. Therefore, the number of actual retractions that should happen is way lower than what is reported. Why do you think retractions warrant the same publicity as the original articles?
Yeah, one of the things that's changed actually, and I'm not going to disagree with you exactly, but I'm going to sort of maybe put some context around what you just said there, in passing about retractions not getting the coverage that sort of original papers do. That's still, largely true, but actually much less true than it used to be. I think, and this is, I think, part of a larger sort of meta point or a meta discussion about what we've done and what others have done, and kind of the ecosystem, the larger interest in it. When we first launched in 2010, it was very rare to see any coverage of retractions. Not that we were the only people doing it, but you would have, large media outlets, give or take once a year, maybe once every few years, cover a very big, significant scandal of some kind that often, involved retractions, not always. That's really changed. We have a lot of competition, which is actually good for the world, and I would argue good for journalism and good for science. Isn't necessarily always great for us because we don't get to break all the stories, but that's not our role has not ever been to be the only voice in town. We love all the other people who are working on this and all the work they're doing. So I would just say that I think actually there's been a lot more attention, certainly lately, to this in the last couple of years in particular. And it's not only in the U.S. As you are well aware. In all parts of the world, we're in touch with reporters and sometimes quoted by them. Sometimes they just pick up stories. Sometimes they're informed by our database. So that's really good. I do think that retractions, or at least the process, deserve as much attention as the original paper, because if the original paper turns out to be wrong and you don't hear about the retraction, whether you're a scientist or a reader or a taxpayer or anyone involved, you're going to end up feeling quite, depressed, and maybe even taken advantage of by that big headline, by that big story about something that turns out to be false. And there's a serious problem now with, mistrust, distrust of many institutions, but that also includes science. I mean, by and large, surveys say and polls say that people still trust science and scientists much more than they trust pretty much any other profession, most other professions, not everyone. But that's declining a bit, and some of the louder voices are even fomenting mistrust. It serves them to boost mistrust, if you will, or build or create mistrust in experts, which scientists obviously are. So I think that we need to be honest about the process, if for no other reason than to, defend against this sort of, well, you're a hypocrite, or we can't trust you because you never tell us when you get things wrong. It's a good thing to tell people when you get things wrong. But at the same time, all the incentives are misaligned. So they're aligned against many things, but one of the things they're aligned against is correcting the record, because you are basically kind of, admitting that this paper or this finding that you have probably built your career on, or that has at least helped you get a professorship or a grant or a promotion, doesn't hold up. And that becomes an existential decision. It's not just sort of correcting, it doesn't anymore feel like just correcting your work. It feels as though you are sort of judging, letting the world judge your CV, your resume. And that, I can understand that. I mean, it's a problem, and we need to maybe talk more today about the incentive structure, but that's a problem. So we estimate that, so right now there are a bit over 50,000 retractions that happened. About a quarter of them happened last year. So which is also very interesting. Maybe we can talk about too, but the 50,000 retractions, roughly that's about 1 in, 500 papers that's being retracted, which is up from about 1 in 5,000 papers 20-something years ago. If you go back to 2002, it's about 1 in 5,000 papers. We estimate, and when I say this number, people often say to me, I was speaking on a panel yesterday, and everyone said, oh, that's too conservative a figure, but it's one that I feel we can support. We estimate that about 2% of papers should be retracted, so about 1 in 50. So that's a delta of about 10. So that there probably should be about tenfold as many retractions as there are. It's based on several lines of evidence. Happy to sort of say more if it's of interest. But again, when I say that number publicly, and I first said it 2 years ago in a commentary in Nature, people say, And I expected people to say, oh, that's too many. I mean, how can you 10 times as many? That's an awful lot. In fact, I get, no, that's too conservative. It should be much higher. And they may not be wrong, but I like to stick to what I can confidently say in an evidence-based way.
Thank you. Let's build on something that you just said. I always consider retraction is like cancer screening. You just, when you look more, you find more. And it's just natural because we publish so many papers around the world. And obviously, as some of the incentive structures around science, as you mentioned, just forces scientists, particularly in a culture where we have publish or perish, to take shortcuts and probably do image manipulation or data fabrication that leads to retraction. Now, let's come to some of the substantive issues in science articles.
Can I comment on that? Because I just want to second what you're saying. It's a sort of metaphor analogy that I often use too. So you're absolutely right. And it is very much like whether it's cancer screening or screening for any condition, any disease. Now, it does mean you come up with false positives. I mean, the metaphor sort of holds, actually. But it very much, the story and the increase in retractions over the past 20 years or so is very much the story of looking for them and people actually doing something about it, right? Exactly. So, and that is, it's really important. I think that's important for a lot of reasons. One of which, though, is it's not actually clear there's more misconduct now. I mean, there's some evidence that maybe there is, and there's certainly different ways to do it, and it's sort of being industrialized. On the other hand, what's clear is that there's a lot of junk in the literature that people haven't found yet. They haven't, looked. But what's wonderful is this community of sleuths, right? These, again, this panel I was on yesterday, one of them who's actually a sleuth herself, estimated it's probably about 100 people who are sort of regularly doing this. And that's probably a reasonable figure. It's kind of amazing to think that, until quite recently, they couldn't do that kind of work because, the technology was not available. Not everything was available online. I mean, imagine when I was in medical school, for example, which I don't think was that long ago, but sounds long ago. But, this was the mid-1990s. If I wanted to look at a paper, I had to go to the basement where the journal issues were. I had to hope that it was there and it hadn't been taken out. And then if I wanted to compare that to, say, another paper, which is a lot of the work that sleuths do, images that are duplicated or plagiarized text, things like that, I'd have to find that one. And then I'd kind of have to hold them up to my eyes. And now that's all online. And you can superimpose things. You have software. Some people are using AI. It's not surprising, to your point, that we're finding more, or people are finding more. There is also a will in some quarters, at some places, to actually do something about it, which of course was the other necessary step. But I think it's a fascinating. Adam and I, maybe unconsciously, because we sort of sensed this was going on, but I wouldn't claim that we thought about this. We picked the right time to do this. It's sort of like I talk about picking the right time. I became a vegetarian about was it 6 years ago now, and I know that if I had tried to become a vegetarian, even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, certainly, I would have missed certain foods too much. But now I can get, fake beef, which I actually think is quite tasty. It's like without thinking through it, I actually managed to pick the right time. Right. So it's a wonderful time actually for retractions, I guess.
Absolutely. So I wanted to come to some of the substantive issues in Science article. Last year, you and Adam wrote 2 articles, one in Scientific American and the other in the English Delhi, The Guardian. You covered the scandal that broke out in Stanford, and it is a very high-profile scandal. I'm speaking about, of course, the then president of Stanford, Dr. Mark Tessier-Levy, and his role in fabricating a series of scientific articles. Following the investigation by Stanford, he stepped down. In fact, Stanford said that Dr. Mark had fostered an environment that led to, and I quote, unusual frequency of manipulation of research data and or substandard scientific practice, unquote. In 4 out of 5 of his papers that were reviewed by the committee, where he was the principal author, there were problems and he agreed to retract 2 science paper, 1 cell paper, and submit correction for others. In fact, I want to tell our listeners that Dr. Tessier Levine is not alone in this type of manipulation. There are many, many stories that are worthy of retraction but never get retracted. We are only highlighting Stanford case because it's one of the high-profile cases like the one that happened in Dana-Farber Institute that we covered extensively in one of our podcasts with Sholto David recently. However, Ivan, the problem is much bigger than this, isn't it? Now, what happened in Stanford is just a symptom of a larger problem. So talk about us, the larger problem, and talk about what the community of scientists, universities, and publishers are doing.
Yeah, I mean, the Mark Tessier Levine case certainly grabbed a lot of attention, and well, it should. That's not. I don't think that's a bad thing. It only becomes a negative thing if we forget, which was the point we were trying to make really in both of those articles, which you kindly mentioned in The Guardian and Scientific American. We were trying to make the point that, okay, let's not let down our guard. Let's sort of realize that this, again, as you put it, is a symptom of a much larger problem. Tessier Levine, and I just should be clear, Stanford and the report, and I think all the evidence is quite clear, he did not do the manipulation himself, but he, as you said, he created this environment that, sort of demanded that, or demanded certain kinds of results, which were going to be very difficult to get the old-fashioned way, the honest way. And so and he's now, by the way, left Stanford altogether, and he has now started, he's the head of CEO or something of a $1 billion, a company with
So I have a question on that as well later.
So, sorry to jump to
problem.
That. But in any case, I think to your actual question here about, again, I think it was the Guardian piece where and actually, no, it was in Stat when the Mark Tessier Levine case first broke, which was end of 2022. A student reporter at the Stanford Daily broke it, of course. What's noteworthy is a couple things. One is that we actually, and I don't mean we like Retraction Watch, although I do think we were aware of them. The allegations were actually sort of available publicly for years, 7-8 years before 2022. And that speaks to a couple things. One is that there are a lot of allegations out there. They're on a site called PubPeer, which your listeners may know about. Yes. I'm full disclosure, I'm on the board of directors of the PubPeer Foundation, a volunteer position, but I obviously believe strongly in the organization and what they do. And so there are lots of allegations on PubPeer, many of which are quite legitimate and worthy of at least some sort of action or at least some investigation. But most of them, to your point, until quite recently, have not been addressed, and no one was even reading them, or they were reading them and ignoring them. And so that has become much more difficult. But again, if you look at, and the point we made in this stat piece in 2022 is that there are many retractions for image manipulation, inappropriate image manipulation happening every day. So, at the time we wrote that piece, there were, I think, something like 5,000 retractions a year. There are more now, of course. But, if you think about that's whatever the number is, 100, that's 100 a week. Several of them each day probably were for something like image manipulation because it's something that's least typically looked for. So this is happening, and it's happening at a university like Stanford, which is held in very high regard, very prestigious. It's happening at, if you will, and I hate university rankings, I think they're a big problem, but universities that may not be ranked quite as highly as Stanford, happening around the world. And you sort of see these bursts where people start paying attention. And so, no, this is, it doesn't mean that we should excuse the behavior. Just because something's happening all the time doesn't mean we shouldn't try and stop it and call attention to it first and then try and stop it or prevent it. But it does mean that it's actually quite common. And I think we need to be, again, all more honest about that.
Absolutely. And I want to pick on something that you just mentioned, and that is PubPeer. It was PubPeer that initially actually had flagged Dr. Tessier Levine's articles, which was subsequently picked by then, as you mentioned, the Stanford freshman Theo Baker, with some help from Elizabeth Bick, who is known as the image sleuth. And then ultimately he unfolded the story. For our listeners who may not know, PubPeer is a website that allows its users to review and discuss scientific research post-publication, and most importantly, allows the users to do that anonymously. In fact, it is known in the scientific community as a site for whistleblowers. Even PubPeer was anonymously founded, as you know, in 2012. Its founders revealed themselves in 2015 on the very site and made clear on their intentions. Now, the most controversial aspect of PubPeer is its ability for others to post comment anonymously. This can be very dangerous at times. As you know, science, like many other professions, are very competitive. And it may involve jealousy, and other scientists can post anonymously or false comments on their competitors' work. In your opinion, is anonymous posting on sites like PubPeer a good thing? I mean, has it achieved its stated objective, or is there a better way? I ask this because in certain places, like in your country, for example, US, which is a very litigious society, people can actually sue each other, which can cost a lot of money, mental stress, and requires courage to fight the legal case, even when there is no merit to the case. And here I also must mention, in societies outside of the US, there is a danger to the whistleblower if the whistleblower does it knowingly and publishing his name, even if things done publicly. For example, as you know well, a Bangladeshi scientist was actually murdered in 2006 by revealing the scientific misconduct in the papers of one of his politically connected junior colleagues. In fact, it took 17 years for the victim to get justice, which ultimately resulted in the hanging of the perpetrators of the crime. So, in your opinion, what is the right way of achieving this, anonymously or publicly?
No, I think it's a great question. And I think that, so first of all, I mean, PubPeer itself was technically, I shouldn't say they were sued. That's a legal term, of course, but someone tried to subpoena them, someone who they had written about and who now has more than 40 retractions, actually. He passed away, Fazl Sarkar, just sometime in the past year. So he wanted to sue the anonymous commenter who had left many comments about his papers. And so since they're anonymous, that person's anonymous, in order to get the name, you would have to subpoena PubPeer. And PubPeer had an ironclad rule, which they don't disclose any names. They actually went even further, and they don't even know information. They delete all the information that might identify people, IP address, things like that. They did that in the wake of this. They won the case. In other words, they did not, the judge said they did not have to provide the name. Took a lot of effort. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, took the case for them, which meant that their costs were pretty minimal, and ACLU thought it was an important case. So that even there, like within sort of a meta story of being, again, quote unquote sued or trying to be subpoenaed. Look, I think that what we have to talk about is the power differential, which you mentioned about the tragic case in Bangladesh, for example, where even if someone wasn't politically connected, they could sort of exact revenge, if you will, vengeance. We've seen other cases like this. Fortunately, I don't know of any others off the top of my head that involved someone being killed, being murdered. But certainly people's careers being harmed, and even sometimes physical harm or harassment and things like that. I think we just have to be honest about that, and so therefore it's sort of and again, it doesn't have to be that severe. It could just be that quietly, senior faculty say don't hire that person, or don't, that person can't be on a paper or can't get whatever they need in their career. That's almost not worse, but it's more pernicious. It's probably happening we know it's happening all the time without people necessarily naming it. So I think we have to be honest about that, and that's the conflict, right, between, or the conflicting priorities between trying to make sure the scientific literature and science sort of are as clean as possible and as honest as possible, rigorous as possible, and sort of what I think would be better, right, is transparency about who's bringing the claim. And we always, as journalists, would prefer to have people on the record publicly using their names. But that is, to me, that's actually less of a priority than the larger picture, and protecting people is actually maybe even the bigger priority. So in terms of anonymity, you mentioned, people who might, post false comments. That's always a risk. And we should be honest about that too. That being said, PubPeer does moderate comments. So are there cases where things slip through that maybe they shouldn't? Of course, but you can always moderate them later. In fact, some sleuths who are so frustrated by the lack of action by publishers, by institutions, by authors, they wish PubPeer wasn't moderated. They wish it wasn't gated. And I understand that, but as a journalist who understands libel laws, certainly here in the US and actually in some other countries, who understands the value of being trusted and not having sort of false claims on your site or what have you, I very much support both anonymity and the moderation. And so, because at the end of the day, even if someone is your worst enemy, right? Even if someone actually has an agenda to destroy your career, they're either right or wrong on the facts. And now the facts may be selective, right? And so you should provide some context around it. But at the end of the day, again, I mean, we're living through this in the United States on a political level right now. Courts are making decisions, all sorts of things are happening. Obviously, the voters will make decisions come November. But, when you look at motivation, it's very important. And whenever you can, you should try and figure out what the motivations are, but you should judge each claim on its merits, on the facts. That anonymous commenting allows for. And so I think there's a tendency to dismiss comments, find reasons to dismiss allegations, and one of them being anonymity. And I don't think that's, if I'm being direct, I don't think that's intellectually honest.
Right. Thank you. And for our listeners, when Ivan was talking about ACLUs, he was talking about the American Civil Liberties Union. Just for the clarity, I wanted to say that. Now, I want to talk about the repercussions of retraction or doing bad science. Now, speaking of the same case in Stanford, although the then president resigned, as we talked about, he headed to a biotech startup. And you already mentioned that probably had nearly $1 billion investment. Now, all this is important to talk about because it shows to our younger generation, a kid who is in the high school and wants to be a scientist by chasing his or her their dream, is being involved in plagiarism doesn't really matter at the end. Some may make some noise here and there, but what matters at the end is once you have a big name, you can actually get away with the misdeeds. In conclusion, no one suffers from committing these blunders. Would you agree?
Well, I think, first of all, people do suffer from committing these blunders, but it's not necessarily the people who commit them, right? It's all of us. It's the public. It's if in the case of public health research or medical research, it's people who are suffering from a particular disease, their families. It's also other scientists, right? So, and to get, maybe to if I may, and I'm going to get back to your question, but if I may sort of take the example of this high school student who, or junior high school student who only wants to be, just is enamored by science and the wonder of it and the kind of, learning more and the knowledge creation and all of that, let's say gets to graduate school, has that fire, has that inspiration, that creativity, gets to graduate school, and the head of the lab, right, the principal investigator, says, here's an interesting paper from this other group. Could you go and replicate it? In other words, do these experiments yourself and see what you get? Because I think we should maybe try and, build on the work in some way. So the grad student says, great, wonderful, that's an interesting paper. Goes off and goes to the bench or whatever, the field, whatever the work is, and tries and tries and tries, can't find the same results. Just nothing. It tries this, tries that, does it 4 times, comes back to the comes back to the principal investigator and says, I'm sorry, I can't replicate this. I can't repeat. It doesn't work the same way. The usual response, right, is, oh, well, you're doing something wrong, or, well, maybe you're not very good at this, or some version of that, maybe kinder, maybe more polite. Think about that. When this paper was actually wrong, what the graduate student has done is science. It's better science than that paper that got published in the fancy journal. That's the person that gets harmed, and science therefore gets harmed, because what does that person do? That person says, I must not be very good at this. Like, we've all had this experience. I almost failed third semester calculus my first year of college. I decided I'm probably not meant for biophysics. That's what I was going to major in. I majored in biology instead. Did just fine. But, that's horrible. I mean, it wasn't horrible for me. I probably really shouldn't have done that, in biophysics. But this is so, it's heartbreaking story to me, and it happens every day. So people are harmed. Now, as to the people who do it, the people who commit the misconduct, I've been quoted saying the most likely sort of path, the most likely outcome for someone who commits misconduct is a long and fruitful career. Because most people are not even caught, let alone if they are caught, does anything terrible happen to them. Tessier Levine is interesting because on the one hand, yes, he resigned his presidency, but that's a pretty august position. I don't think that Mark Tessier Levine is ever going to require public assistance. Right? I don't think he's ever going to be in any trouble for that in that way. And I have no, like, I wish no one needed public assistance, but I also, I don't have any problem with people making lots of money either, but this sort of inequity is pretty severe. So I think, again, there's we have a term, it's actually an Italian term, but omerta, right? So the kind of silence. And so people were, we talk also about circling the wagons. It's another metaphor here that has to do with the Old West. So, that's what people do, right? You've worked with these people forever. You yourself are vulnerable. And so you think, well, if I don't protect this person, if I don't sort of say, no, that's all fine, let's move on, maybe somebody else is going to find something about me and they're not going to support me. So there's a real, again, that's a real problem. And the people who get hurt, again, it's like whistleblowers always, almost exclusive, you look at whistleblower stories. There's a great book out now, just came out by Carl Elliott about whistleblowers. And when you look at that, the universal story for whistleblowers is that they suffer consequences. They suffer harm, lose their jobs, maybe even worse. Maybe somebody finds some tiny problem with, you talk about sort of false allegations, some tiny problem that may even be true about something they've done, and it gets blown out of proportion so that they can get discredited. Whereas the people being accused, and who often have done what they are accused of, they don't suffer any consequences. And that should bother scientists. It should bother everyone, but it should particularly bother scientists who have to compete with those people for funding, which is very scarce. So, yeah, it's a big issue.
No, absolutely. I do agree that the perpetrators of the misconduct often get unnoticed and don't pay the price that they should. Now, that brings Ivan to the question on the role of universities and publishers. What are they exactly doing to correct science? In fact, in most cases, as you know, it is not the universities or publishers that pay the price. And in your opinion, what should the universities and publishers do when they find one of their faculty or one of the papers which is published in their high-profile journals actually is retracted? Because often we see stonewalling. Universities are very reluctant to accept in the first place unless the story becomes public, as we discussed in some of the high-profile cases, and then they form a committee, and the committee finds the truth, but actually doesn't do something which raises hope among younger people. And same with journals. Journals are more worried about their reputation, so they do something, particularly in the era of artificial intelligence and the paper mills that we know, that the journals want to have a clean name, but they actually don't do anything substantive, do they?
So again, I at a high level, I agree with you. Journals, institutions are really not doing enough, however, some of them are doing a bit more than they used to. And I think that we should, I'm all for pointing attention to, shining a spotlight on problems. It's what we do every day at Retraction Watch. And I think we need to continue doing that. That being said, we should also point out where things have changed a bit or are changing for various reasons, which I'll get into, because I think there's a couple things. So again, universities have a real conflict of interest in investigating their own, right, or in acknowledging that there's a problem within their ranks. And I want to get first, it's sort of very directly in terms of, funding and public perception. But it gets to a much larger issue, which I've started writing more about and speaking more about recently, which is that a lot of this, I think, if not all of it, has to do with the sort of citation market, the sort of, citation economy. And that has to do with international rankings of universities. Universities care a lot about them because they often determine their funding. Countries care a lot about them. So if you look, there's been a whole bunch of stories in the last couple of years about China, for example, overtaking the United States in terms of certain key metrics. In other words, China, scientific superpower, I think it was the last one in The Economist. That story neglected to mention how many retractions there have been and how some of the problems, which was striking to me because The Economist has done some really great work pointing all those things out. Okay, so maybe one hand isn't speaking to the other or what have you. But this is the problem. And so in order to get cited, you need to be published, right? And so universities are going to make everything about publication. You only hire people who you think will publish a lot. You only give tenure to people who publish a lot, all of that. So again, it's this sort of misaligned incentive structure that we really need to deal with in some way. Now, some universities and institutions, and I put, medical school, sort of medical centers, et cetera, in that category. You mentioned Dana-Farber earlier. I think it's actually worth noting if you compare the two stories of Marquesi-Levine and Dana-Farber, Stanford and Dana-Farber, the different approaches they took. Marquesi-Levine, hired reputation management firms, lawyers, sort of to try and fight all of this. He tried to, sort of really destroy the sort of reputation of Theo Baker, who was the student reporter, which is just awful, even if Theo Baker was wrong, which he wasn't. But for the president of Stanford to try and denigrate a first-year student, I'm sorry, just based on that, he should have faced consequences. But you compare that to Dana-Farber, and you mentioned that you had interviewed Sholto David. So I'm sure he told you this story, or his version of the story exactly. But one of my takeaways is that there was very little drama. They saw the allegations. They were raised to them, early, I think it was January when they sort of saw them, was published. And within a month or two, there was some other coverage and what have you, but they just sort of, okay, we're going to retract these and correct them or request all this stuff. And those are still happening because the journals are so slow. But the lack of drama and the lack of acrimony, I think, is what we should learn from, because there will be continuity problems at every institution. So I think that, institutions in some cases are actually doing something, but whether publishers are or not, they have been, I would argue, dragged and pushed and forced to take action because, again, these things are becoming public. And in one particular case, in Wiley, which their acquisition of Hindawi 3 years ago, it's a much smaller publisher. Wiley's a major publisher. Hindawi is a small, much smaller, but growing open access publisher, meaning it's based on what are known as article processing charges, right? So pay to publish, which is sometimes strange for people to hear about, but very lucrative. They are the ones who actually had to retract well over 10,000 papers in the last couple of years because of paper mill activity. We haven't talked about paper mills, and maybe you want to talk about that too. And so, but what happened was a little more than a year ago, they had to announce that because they're a publicly traded company on the stock market. They had to announce that, give that news to their shareholders at a quarterly earnings call. Their stock price dropped 16% that day. And the reaction from a lot of people in publishing was, oh no one's gonna, that's bad that they were punished that way. Maybe, but they should have done something about it before. And so in any case, I would argue, they're finally taking action now, and other publishers are too. And some of them hire research integrity managers and do things like that. They're actually quite useful and positive. And a couple of journals have been doing that for years, like well over a decade. Most have just started in the last few years. So that's all, I think, the milieu, but it all gets back to this incentive structure and the fact that all of this, in one way or another, is based on citations and the citation economy. And I think, and so much of the rankings are based on citations, which are really easy to gain, right? So after this podcast, maybe you and I can talk about, well, you publish a paper and, how about I'll cite you and you can cite me later. It's so easy to gain. You can cite yourself, and until quite recently, that was counted the same way. So this is, to me, we have to really look at that if we want to sort of fix these problems. But, publishers and universities, again, there are regulations in different countries, but it's largely unregulated. In terms of the funding, for example, if you don't sort of go through certain steps in many countries, you can't get funding again. I mean, that's oversimplified. In fact, you can, but there's maybe some sanctions. Publishing is essentially an unregulated industry. There's only been one, and I know the framework in the US best, but we do cover international cases. There's only been, there are organizations in various countries that sort of have white lists of journals where, and India actually in particular has a quite, prominent one. But like, for example, Finland just downgraded a whole bunch of journals in the last couple of weeks as we're speaking, because people raised problems with them and they investigated and what have you. So there's that, but that's somewhat unofficial. I mean, it's official, but it doesn't carry any sort of regulatory or, certainly civil or criminal penalty. The only sort of federal agency here in the US, which has actually taken action, regulatory action, in fact, court action against the publisher, excuse me, was not the NIH, or the FDA, or one of the organizations, or NSF, which you think would be very concerned about publishing, and they are, but this was not what they did. It was actually the Federal Trade Commission, because a publisher called Omics, which is actually based in India, even though they claim to be based in other places. What's known as a quote unquote predatory publisher. I don't like that term, but essentially false advertising. So the FTC, which is not a scientific agency, they looked at it and said, this is false advertising, and that's now you're on our property here. So we're going to take over. They actually successfully, they got a $50 million US settlement. Well, it was actually, I don't think it was a settlement. They actually it was a fine, because Omics, I don't think, ever showed up to the case or anything. They won't collect that, but my point is that it's a largely unregulated industry, and that maybe has to change.
Absolutely. And I think, I do agree with you that certain institutions are more proactive in dealing with retractions when they come to know than others. And in this context, I want to tell you that there was a news article published in Nature last year that said there were 10,000 retractions last year alone. And you mentioned that in your previous comment that out of 50,000, most of them actually came in the last year. And that particular news piece actually highlighted certain countries, and you mentioned China. It highlighted, in addition to China, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Russia being one of the top list. And because of what we just discussed about some of the incentive structures pressing the scientists, the faculty to do misconduct, and in fact, universities being a place where they always find something to latch onto which will give them better ranking. Now, towards the end of the podcast we are coming, and I have to ask you the question and give you some of the comments and context about India. Now, as of this morning, I did a search. The Retraction Watch database has 3,575 articles that were retracted from India, out of which 2,701 were research articles. Now, this is a huge number. It may not be as huge as other countries, but still is huge. I think this number is heavily underrepresented for the reasons that we discussed so far. There have been some cases of plagiarism and scientific misconduct in India, including by some famous scientists in India, and some of them from very high-profile scientific institutions. However, in all these cases, either the case was hushed up directly or through some spam or the sham committee that was formed, which did not act against the perpetrator of misconduct, or the students and the junior colleagues who actually blamed for the misconduct. Now, here I want to tell retraction need to be seen in a cultural context. In many Asian countries, as you may know, including in India, the scientist who retracts may be shamed and lose the face in the public and in the institution that the scientist works. So it is very important to tell and emphatically state that genuine retractions are a good thing in science. And in fact, we all do mistakes. Therefore, if a mistake is identified that is genuine in the lab, either in the experimental procedure, methodology, or analysis, and we find, or a student or a postdoc comes to the lab head or the PI stating, as you mentioned in one of the cases, that the experiment doesn't work, the analysis doesn't hold up, it is our responsibility to take that seriously and investigate. And if we do find that it doesn't hold up, to retract the article. So retraction, by definition, is not a bad thing. And in fact, we should not really be shaming and naming the people who are doing genuine retraction, because as we know, working in science for a long time, and particularly if you are running a large lab, is not practically possible for the PI to see each and every experiment analysis that a student or a postdoc does. And in that context, what would you tell students and young scientists in India about scientific misconduct and retractions? And most importantly, how should the scientific community in India report issues related to scientific misconduct and retractions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, well, first of all, I'll give a maybe too direct response to one part of that, which is, we have had, at Retraction Watch for many years, a category, which is actually reflected in the database, called Doing the Right Thing. We actually, at one point, gave out an award for that when we had a column at Stat. And we should absolutely reward that behavior. People actually don't even like accepting that award because there's such stigma around retraction. But only about 20% of retractions are due to honest error. And I think that that's for many reasons. Again, as you said, retraction rates are clearly an undercount, an underestimate. So there may be more that people, if there wasn't a stigma, would come forward about. We've seen some cases of pretty prominent scientists who come forward about their mistake. Nobel Prize winners. The Nobel Prize winners are split, it seems, and there are a number of them who've had retractions. They're split between people who come out and talk about it, and or even before we even learn about it, they're making statements about it. Excuse me. And then there are ones who try and criticize the people who are bringing the or ignore them altogether. I'm thinking actually of someone else at Stanford, not Mark Tessier-Levine, but someone named Thomas Sudhoff, who
I know.
sort of, really in many ways and made some, somewhere between sort of misleading and even false claims about the people bringing, allegations against him. And I think, and he's a Nobel Prize winner and all of that. One retraction, some corrections, and I think some more corrections on the way. But I think we need to honor and celebrate and cherish that kind of good behavior, not his, but good behavior about doing the right thing and about coming forward about honest error, or just unknown reason for error. Like you can't figure out what went wrong, but it went wrong somehow, and you're going to tell people about it, so they're going to waste more time. But we also should tell the stories of people who are committing misconduct and for whom there's evidence that there is misconduct. We've been doing this again for 14 years. People have reacted in various ways, as you might expect. But most people, at least privately, and actually support the idea of talking about the retractions for bad behavior. Yes, retractions can, shame and sort of maybe have a detrimental effect on careers, but they're good data. So economists over the years have looked at retractions, and they've looked at citations after that and sort of what happens not just to that researcher's work, but to the whole field. And they found quite consistently that if retractions are for honest error, you don't suffer any, in other words, you don't suffer any citation consequence. I know it's ironic for me to sort of talk about citations as a marker of anything when I think that that's really a problem. But on a day-to-day basis, they absolutely are a mark of whether somebody is going to value that work or not, or think highly of it. Whereas if you commit misconduct, and the retraction says so, then you will see a decline in your citations after that. I don't think that that's inappropriate. And I think that the problem is that the people making the argument most vociferously, most loudly for don't name and shame are the people who've actually committed misconduct. Certainly there are people who really want to, I'm sure there are people who want to talk about their mistakes and feel as though they will be tarred with the same brush. And that's why we need clear retraction notices. We need to tell the whole story. we can't just let this sort of stigma, and it's like any other false binary. It's like any other sort of assumption, whether it's color of someone's skin, whether or not they believe this or not, whatever it is, they're all false binaries. In other words, it's all a spectrum and continuum, and we need to be honest about that. And when we are, again, the data support the idea that the right things happen, or the things we would hope happen.
Thank you. Ivan, with that, we have come to the end of this podcast. I want to thank you for your time in educating our listeners on scientific misconduct and the role of retraction in science literature. Thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thank you, Vinay. Great to speak to you.